Welcome to Definitely Maybe Agile, the podcast where Peter Maddison and Dave Sharrock discuss the complexities of adopting new ways of working at scale. Hello, Dave. How are you today?
With a wry smile there. Yes, I'm looking forward to the conversation. I've had a few thoughts on it, and maybe I'll try and remove any of the stronger opinions that I had. We'll see if they come out or not. We're talking about capacity management. Sorry, it's a bit early for that, but maybe capacity management. It's important, isn't it? We have project managers that manage capacity all the time. So what's the value of capacity management?
Well, we want to know how much of it we have left, right? I mean, if like Bob over there is like 10% on project X and 15% on project Y and another 65% on project Z, then he's got a little bit of space left, right? He could do another project.
I'm trying to think how to phrase this statement. So
be polite.
Let me push back a little bit. My first perspective is that in knowledge work, which is where we experience most of the organizations we work with, we're focused on knowledge work. Capacity management is a red herring. I would really, really, really like organizations to stop talking about capacity management.
Yep. I would 100% agree, but then there's a couple of quite large businesses that sell companies these very large, expensive products that cost millions of dollars to implement, which would be very upset to hear you say that.
So I think there's a couple of things that we can look at. Let's try and explore it. So one is probably the situation I see absolutely the most commonly from the organization that we work with is a leadership team, senior leadership team, that is struggling to reconcile the amount of work delivered by their organization compared to the size of the organization, the cost, the size, the number of people, whatever it might be. So there's this fundamental mismatch between the amount of work that gets delivered versus the amount of people and costs and so on that we're investing in it. So there's a clear, I am not happy with how much work we are getting out of the teams, out of the delivery organization.
Yes, and they're a lot of the times it's because they're looking at, well, there's all of these things I need doing. I've got all of this pressure to make sure that I deliver. I've made all of these commitments without actually talking to the teams, mind you, but we've made all of these commitments about what needs to be delivered. And so we've got to make sure that it happens, and they just do not seem to be going fast enough.
Well, I actually have a lot of empathy for those leadership teams, because very often, as you're describing, as soon as you overload a system, we know about this all the time, right? As we overload the system, work in progress goes up. The consequence of high work in progress is longer delivery time, which means less gets delivered. So that Little's law, expression of Little's law is we see it all the time when we walk into an organization. The challenge is that leadership don't understand or recognize or look at that consequence of increasing work in progress slows down your delivery. And their feeling is somebody somewhere isn't working as hard as they could, so we could get more work in. And it's a very, very, it's an outdated managerial perspective from literally 100 years ago, 100 and something years ago.
Yes, time and motion studies, Taylorism, all of these wonderful things. Turn of the century, not turn of the century just gone, the turn of the century before.
Yes, yeah. And in a world where there wasn't the knowledge work that we're doing now, it was manufacturing, widgets and tightening bolts and putting seats and so on together into automobiles or whatever that was being built. Time and motion studies in that context works pretty well and has proven to work pretty well, at least through the middle of the last century. The headache is that when you hit knowledge work, so much of the work is invisible.
Yeah, and it actually has the opposite effect of the one that you're expecting. Right. Instead of getting like higher throughput, greater output, and hitting your targets, instead you end up with a lot of functional silos who are dedicated into the single space they do, because obviously that'll make things go faster. And as you overload each of them, they become so busy they can't take on new work. So because everyone's working at 100% and the next silo needs their help, everything jams up all the way down the line. And so it takes forever for anything to get through the system. And of course, new opportunity comes in, quick, drop whatever you're doing.
Yeah. And we don't see, I mean, I'm always thinking of the manufacturing, the assembly line, and you've got cars moving along. Well, there's only so many cars you can put on there. And if you stop, the assembly line is full. So trying to add another vehicle to that assembly line means taking another vehicle off because it's obvious in that context. But when we're doing technical work, knowledge work, that's all invisible. So what we actually do is we just put it to one side, and that kicks off all of these delays that we don't necessarily, it's really difficult for us to track. And again, there are tools out there that will purport to help you track all of that. But I think that one's just that misunderstanding right at the outset of we're not getting as much output as we'd like, outcomes that we want to see. Therefore, there must be room for us to add more work in the current system. That on its own would be something that I'd love to see change. The question instead from those senior leaders should be, how do I reduce the amount of work we've got going through so that until we start seeing a flow of work? How do we just lower that until we start seeing something, and then we can start learning and move from?
It's the strategy question, right? It's the, if I say yes to this, what am I saying no to?
Precisely.
And if you're saying yes to everything, then you're not prioritizing, you're just accumulating. And if you're just accumulating work into the system, you're just going to grind it to a halt. Same as any system. If you just keep piling more and more work into it, it will stop functioning. So there is a need to understand the capacity of your system, but just not the way that organizations think of the capacity of their system.
Well, and this comes to that second piece, which is predictable delivery, which is my capacity of the system. How much work can this organization deliver or this team deliver on a regular basis per week cadence? That's a way we can really begin tackling capacity headaches, because we begin to ask interesting questions like, historically, what's the performance of a team been? And are we moving from that historical norm? Is there something that's changed in the last period, the last month, that meant that that's delivering less or more than has historically been there? That's a good place to start.
It is. And it takes time to build up that organizational knowledge, just the same as if you bring a new team into an organization, it takes them time to adapt and learn the organization. And that's a key part of it. One of the other pieces that you touched on there, and I was joking about earlier, is this slicing and dicing of people into different spaces, which also doesn't work well. It's like there's this conceptual idea that I could spend 10% here, 10% there, 10% there, all across 10 projects. No, that's not happening. The context switching will take up 60 to 80% of the time just trying to do that.
And I do think that once we start looking at the past performance, I mean, there's a couple of things that have to come into play. One is we can't look over 12 months, especially, in the context of today's market, we're going to look at probably a month or less. Has to be in that, because things are changing so rapidly. But the second thing is that what we typically find is very quickly you find that organizations don't track work in the right way. Either the work packages are partially complete, so we're continuously hitting that whole percent complete conversation, which is a distraction. And I still remember years ago at one of the Agile conferences listening to Ron Jeffries, one of the signatories of the Agile Manifesto. And I loved it. I mean, he's a phenomenal technologist and programmer and really comes from that engineering side. And he was just sitting in the conversation. He just turned around and said, I'm one of the world's best at delivering 90% of what you're looking for, but I'm the world's slowest at getting to the last 100%. That last 10% takes forever. And I think that's this problem with partially complete. We're optimistic. We think we're nearly there. We're percent complete is kind of getting there. But that last piece is where all of the uncertainty and the bits that we couldn't fix come into play. So we need to package work in a way that it's finished and we can move on, finished and we can move on.
Yeah. And this, a lot of organizations struggle with the concept of MVP because it's they want it to be complete and they consider that as a non-complete solution. But I mean, one of the other pieces that directly correlates to that is that of features in a piece of software, only the first 20% are ever really used. So the other 80% of what you're building is money you're throwing down the drain because you just don't need to build it. So don't.
Yeah. In fact, your product managers should be targeted on taking 100% of those features and throwing away the 80% that you know you don't need. It's just trying to make that decision.
I told the executive in charge of a business line the other day, just the one question you need to ask is every time one of your leaders comes to you, just ask them what have they said no to.
Yeah.
If they have nothing they said no to,
Yeah.
then that just means they're just accumulating more work because more work is coming in. It's so many sources of work.
And I just as I'm talking and we're talking about this sort of what we're saying no to, how to reprioritize, how to package the work up, I would say we've got to also make sure that that piece of work is complete and kind of deploys, is released, yes, gets feedback. There's some sort of completion of that isn't just passed on to the next team, because we now just end up with cascading sequences of it's nearly done,
But then we have to look at what is your delivery system in your organization. Because if your delivery system in your organization is a series of handoffs all the way through to the production, then whomever is early in that chain that's potentially building it probably never gets any feedback as to whether what they built was suitable. So you've got to really think about what is your delivery system architecture? Like, how are you designing that? Yeah. Are you aligned correctly to the products you're putting into market? Yeah. And then that's really one of the other key pieces of that, to really start to understand what capacity looks like in your environment.
I really like what you're describing there about that sort of understanding of your process and getting feedback loops and so on. I would also say, I don't think you have to spend 6 months doing all that.
Oh, no.
I think you start with where you're at. It's working well enough, or it's working sufficiently. So beginning to understand with a sort of very strong Pareto principle is we're not trying to understand everything. We're understanding where our pressure points are today and make a few adjustments, and then that whole element of continuous improvement really just helps take the scale of the change out of the conversation.
Yes, exactly. And one of the things, because I mean, we've been always touching on AI these days, of course, but one thing that we definitely see is that AI accelerates those breaking points. Yeah. You hit them much more quickly now, and they become much more visible. Because
and almost catastrophic as well, because this isn't, if I just use it for an example as a store taking delivery and AI is used, and instead of getting 1 delivery a day, they may get 30. It's not like they get 2 deliveries a day. They're all of a sudden just totally blocking the entire neighborhood and preventing anything happening because of the acceleration that's generated. So this is one of the things that we see is organizations that think adding AI and accelerating it isn't going to break it. It'll just highlight a few problems, and actually it causes this gumming up of the works if we're not.
Yeah. And then a good example is if you could generate a whole bunch of things, I'm going to push them all out. But if there's no thought gone into from the other side of that as the intent, how am I going to measure whether this thing that I'm releasing is actually having the impact I expected it to? Yeah. Then I've got no feedback loop. So I'm just throwing more stuff and seeing what sticks, which I can do very quickly, providing the bit on the other end is capable of doing it quickly.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, for sure.
So I think this is a very interesting conversation. And yes, I run into a lot of the same problems that organizations often look at capacity in terms of counting headcount and percentage utilization on different projects. And we try to steer them away from that to an understanding that this is daft, don't do it. And if they want the same outcomes a lot of the time, they really are looking for predictability, understanding of like what work is going on, when's it going to be ready is one of the big questions, especially from the sales folks who've got to go stand in front of a customer and say, that mobile app, it's going to be here tomorrow, right, guys? You're behind me, right? And so there's a lot of dependencies into that, and that creating that common understanding across the end-to-end value chain is really key, because and as you said, it doesn't have to take a lot of effort to do that. It can happen very quickly, and the benefits of just making that visible and understanding it can be incredibly valuable.
I might just add to what you're saying there, Peter, which is depending on where you are in the organization and what kind of clout you have, what we'll often see is that you'll need to continue providing that capacity information.
Yes.
because the likelihood of you really being able to say, hey, we're not going to do that. We're going to go and use this other mechanism to give you your information. It's unlikely to stand the 2 to 6 weeks of work that has to be done to start getting rough data coming through. And much more likely, you're going to want to keep providing the capacity information because there are people doing it and it's happening and they're getting certain insights. And then in parallel to that, start showing them simpler, stronger data that provides more accurate information, more, when I say accurate, not significant number of digits, but more relatable and realistic insights into what is going on in the organization.
Yeah, and your leaders will love it because it will give them the predictability that they're looking for.
Completely, yeah.
And that's the key part of it. Is
it's actionable, right?
It's actionable. You can see it. You can see when it's going off the rails.
Yeah.
You can start to see it, which you never get to because all of the data is inaccurate when you start to try and do it by counting heads and percentage times and feeding it into a central system. But yes, I agree with you. You do very often end up with somebody whose role it is. They might have the title of a project manager whose job it is to go and tap each person on the shoulder and ask them, how much time did you spend on this week? And go fill it into a spreadsheet or into a central system and make sure that's kept up to date so that the central people in an office that may be called an EPMO are happy and can do their reporting to the rest of the organization.
So you're describing some experiences that you've had.
Might have seen it a couple of places, 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, 5. It's not an uncommon pattern. The good organizations I work with move away, but it does take time because there's a different level of understanding that has to go with that, and it takes effort.
Yep, for sure. How do we wrap it up? Three things coming out of that?
3 things coming out of that. So I think the general agreement that the way that capacity is generally tracked in organizations today, and I say generally, there's definitely organizations that are more product centric who manage to get out of this trap, but a lot of legacy organizations still have a habit of counting heads and assigning them a certain percentage to different products, and that's partially to do with this belief that somebody has to be 100% occupied or else we are not getting all the value out of them, which is incorrect. So I think that's one of the key pieces. When somebody is at 100% utilization, you're just increasing handoffs. It's an exponential curve, and you're not going to get the effects you're expecting. So
I think I just draw attention to the request for an understanding of capacity coming from a senior leadership team is completely correct and understandable. Yes. So as much as we've talked about how don't do it and all the rest of it, we need to understand why that question is coming in, and it is completely correct that we have to be able to answer the question in some way. But it isn't one about capacity, it's one about Little's Law and work in progress and cycle times and various discuss that.
Yeah. And I think the introduction of AI is driving that conversation even more right at the moment, because how many people do I need and in what roles? What systems do we need to put AI into so we can get more work coming out? And that's like, it's going to end up in the wrong change. Yeah,
it's not going to give you the response you think it will, right? It's
a lack of understanding of systems and an overbelief in the capabilities of the tooling, which we've seen multiple big press announcements sort of demonstrating exactly that. That people having to backtrack on what they thought was a good idea because they fired half their staff and then found out, whoa, wait a minute, I'm not getting as much out of the system as I was before, and things are falling over.
Exactly. So
that's because you didn't understand your delivery system in the first place when you did that. And so think about what you're doing is, I think, probably.
For sure.
I think then we can probably wrap this up with don't forget to subscribe if you like this conversation, and we're always happy to have people on the show and talk about all sorts of different topics, and that's always a pleasure. And you can reach us at feedback@definitelymaybeagile.com. So until next time.
Until next time, Peter, thanks again.
You've been listening to Definitely Maybe Agile, the podcast where your hosts, Peter Maddison and David Sharrock, focus on the art and science of digital, agile, and DevOps at scale.